The screams echoed through the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Detroit, where the autumn wind rattled the broken windows like skeletal fingers against glass. Sarah Martinez hung suspended from rusted chains, her wrists raw from struggling against the metal restraints that held her captive. The three men surrounding her had been taking turns with their questions for hours now, their patience wearing thin with each deflected answer.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Last chance, cleaning lady, Marcus Thompson sneered, adjusting the grip on the branding iron that glowed orange hot in the makeshift furnace they'd constructed from an old oil drum. The acrid smell of burning metal and fuel filled the air between them. Tell us where Vincent Castellano hides his money, or we mark you permanently like. Sarah's dark hair hung in matted strands across her face, but her brown eyes remained defiant despite the exhaustion that weighed down her slender frame. At 34, she had learned to make herself invisible in the sprawling office complex where she worked the night shift, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while the city's financial elite slept safely in their suburban mansions. Nobody ever noticed the woman in the gray uniform who moved silently through their workspace, collecting their discarded secrets along with their garbage. That invisibility had served her well for 3 years, ever since she'd taken the custodial job at Castellano Holdings. The pay was modest but steady, the work undemanding, and most importantly, it required no background checks or questions about her past. She'd built a quiet life around those night shifts, renting a small apartment in Hamtramck where she could blend into the diverse community of working immigrants who minded their own business. But somehow, these men had connected her to something far more dangerous than emptying wastebaskets and scrubbing conference room floors. "I clean offices," Sarah gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "I don't know anything about anybody's money. I push a mop around and go home. That's it." The second man, Eddie Kowalski, laughed without humor as he paced behind her suspended form. His thick Chicago accent carried the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of extracting information through pain. "See, that's where you're lying to us, sweetheart. We know you've been in Castellano's private office for hours. We got you on security footage, going through his files when you should have been cleaning toilets." The third captor, James Rodriguez, remained silent in the shadows, but Sarah could feel his eyes studying her reactions with the cold calculation of someone who understood fear as a professional tool. He was the one who worried her most. Thompson and Kowalski were thugs who relied on brute force, but Rodriguez possessed the kind of patience that suggested he knew exactly how to break people without leaving obvious marks. "The cameras show you photographing documents," Thompson continued, moving the branding iron closer to her exposed shoulder. The heat radiating from the metal made her skin crawl with anticipation of agony. Corporate financial records, offshore account numbers, stuff that could put our boss away for a very long time. So either you're working for the feds or you're planning to blackmail him yourself. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to center herself despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. These men had abducted her from the parking garage beneath her apartment building, using professional techniques that suggested they were far more than simple muscle hired to intimidate a cleaning woman. The van they'd used had been stolen, the warehouse location carefully chosen for its isolation, and their questioning methods indicated experience with extracting information from unwilling subjects. "I was looking for overtime work," she lied, hoping to buy time while her mind raced through possible escape scenarios. "Mr. Castellano mentioned needing someone to organize his personal files. I thought if I showed initiative, he might give me additional hours." Kowalski struck her across the face with the back of his hand, the impact sending sparks of pain through her skull. "Don't insult our intelligence, lady. We have been watching you for weeks. You photograph specific documents, memorize safe combinations, even planted listening devices in places where important conversations happen. That ain't no cleaning lady behavior." The truth was far more complicated than these men could imagine, but Sarah couldn't explain it without revealing secrets that would put far more than her own life at risk. Her work as a custodian had indeed provided cover for activities that went beyond routine maintenance, but not for the reasons her captors suspected. "Please," she whispered, allowing genuine fear to color her voice while maintaining the persona of a terrified immigrant worker. "I have children. They need their mother. I was just trying to make extra money for their school clothes." Thompson's expression softened slightly at the mention of children, but Rodriguez finally spoke from his position in the shadows, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he was the real decision-maker in this operation. "Enough games. We know she doesn't have kids. Her apartment is set up for one person, no toys, no pictures, no evidence of family anywhere. And her accent slips when she's stressed. She's not the frightened immigrant she pretends to be." The observation hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming that these men had conducted thorough surveillance before making their move. Her carefully constructed cover identity was unraveling under professional scrutiny, forcing her to confront the reality that her 3 years of anonymity were coming to an end.
"Brand her," Rodriguez ordered, his tone carrying the finality of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Start with something small but memorable. Maybe then she'll reconsider her commitment to protecting Castellanos' secrets." Thompson approached with the glowing iron, its tip shaped into a crude letter C that would leave a permanent mark on whatever flesh it touched. The heat grew more intense as it neared her shoulder, and Sarah could smell her own hair beginning to singe from the proximity. "Wait," she gasped, her mind racing through calculations of pain tolerance versus operational security. "Wait, I'll tell you what you want to know." But even as the words left her mouth, Sarah knew she was lying. Whatever these men thought they knew about her activities at Castellano Holdings, they had fundamentally misunderstood both her motivations and her capabilities. The woman who cleaned offices and avoided attention was real enough, but she existed as camouflage for someone else entirely, someone who possessed skills and knowledge that made her far more dangerous than any of her captors could imagine. The branding iron hovered inches from her skin, close enough that she could feel the metal's heat beginning to blister her flesh. Thompson's eyes held the kind of anticipation that suggested he would enjoy the act of marking her, regardless of whether she cooperated with their demands. "That's better," Rodriguez said, stepping closer so she could see his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of bland features that would be forgotten minutes after meeting him. But his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of extracting secrets from people who believed their information was secure. "Now then," he continued, "let's start with something simple. How long have you been working for law enforcement?" The question revealed how little these men actually understood about their situation, despite their thorough surveillance. They had observed her activities and drawn conclusions that fit their pre-existing assumptions about corporate espionage and federal investigations. But the truth was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous than anything involving conventional law enforcement. Sarah raised her head to meet Rodriguez's gaze directly, abandoning the submissive posture she'd maintained throughout the interrogation. When she spoke, her voice carried a clarity and strength that hadn't been present before. "I think," she said quietly, "you gentlemen have made a serious mistake about who you're dealing with." The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting depths of character that contradicts everything her captors thought they knew about the frightened cleaning woman they'd abducted. Thompson paused with the branding iron, still poised to mark her, uncertainty flickering across his features as he registered the transformation in his victim's bearing. But it was Rodriguez who noticed the detail that would change everything. His eyes had been drawn to Sarah's exposed shoulder, where her torn shirt revealed skin that should have been unmarked and vulnerable. Instead, there was already a scar there, an old one, healed but still visible in the harsh light of the warehouse. A scar in the exact shape of the letter they had been preparing to burn into her.
Rodriguez stared at the healed brand mark on Sarah's shoulder, his confidence wavering for the first time since they'd begun the interrogation. The scar was old, at least 5 years by his estimation, and bore the precise craftsmanship that marked it as something far more significant than random violence or amateur intimidation. "Where did you get that mark?" he asked, his voice losing its earlier authority. Sarah's transformation continued as she straightened against her restraints, the fear that had dominated her expression replaced by something harder and more calculating. 3 years earlier, Sarah had walked into the Human Resources office at Castellano Holdings wearing a carefully practiced expression of humble gratitude. Her application for the custodial position had been deliberately unremarkable. A woman in her 30s seeking steady work, with references from cleaning companies that existed only on paper but would verify her employment history if anyone bothered to check. The HR manager, Patricia Wells, had barely glanced at her credentials before approving her for the night shift. Custodial staff were invisible to most corporate executives, which made them perfect for Sarah's purposes. She needed access to a building where powerful people conduct business that interested certain federal agencies, and a mop bucket was her ticket inside. But Sarah's real qualifications for the position went far beyond her ability to operate industrial cleaning equipment. During her first week on the job, she had memorized the building's complete layout, identified every security camera and blind spot, and cataloged the personal habits of the security guards who worked the overnight shifts. By her second week, she had located and bypassed 3 different electronic surveillance systems that weren't part of the building's official security infrastructure. Vincent Castellanos' legitimate business interests included real estate development, construction consulting, and municipal contracts that brought him into regular contact with city officials and union leaders. His less legitimate activities involved laundering money for several criminal organizations that preferred to keep their financial arrangements private from federal oversight.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sarah's assignment had been straightforward. Document Castellano's money laundering operations with enough detail to support federal indictments against his entire network. The work required patience, technical skill, and the ability to remain invisible while photographing financial records that could put dangerous people in prison for decades. She had excelled at all 3 requirements. The night shift at Castellano Holdings typically involved 4 hours of actual cleaning work spread across 8 hours of building access. Sarah used the additional time to systematically photograph every document that passed through Castellano's office, install listening devices in conference rooms where important meetings occurred, and copy the contents of safes that contained backup records for transactions that were too sensitive for digital storage. Her cover as a cleaning woman had provided perfect justification for her presence in areas where unauthorized personnel would have triggered immediate security responses. She emptied trash cans that contained discarded drafts of sensitive correspondence, cleaned conference tables where criminal conspirators had spread financial documents during late-night planning sessions, and maintained surveillance equipment disguised as routine building maintenance tasks. The other custodial staff respected her work ethic and appreciated her willingness to handle the more difficult assignments that came with cleaning executive offices. She volunteered for overtime shifts that coincided with important meetings, ensuring she would be present when significant criminal discussions took place. Her colleagues saw dedication to earning extra income. Federal investigators saw intelligence gathering that exceeded the capabilities of traditional surveillance operations. Marcus Thompson, the day shift supervisor, had been particularly impressed by her attention to detail and professional attitude. He often praised her thoroughness in cleaning areas that previous custodial staff had neglected, never suspecting that her thoroughness involved photographing every document and memorizing every security code she encountered. Even the building's security guards had grown comfortable with her presence during their rounds. She had cultivated relationships with them based on shared coffee breaks and casual conversations about their families, gathering information about their schedules and patrol patterns while establishing herself as a trusted member of the building's overnight staff.
But 3 months ago, Sarah had begun noticing signs that her activities were drawing attention from sources outside the federal investigation she was supporting. Unknown vehicles appeared regularly in the parking area surrounding Castellano Holdings, occupied by individuals who conducted surveillance of their own. Her apartment building's security cameras captured images of people who asked questions about her daily routines and work schedule. The realization that she was being watched had forced Sarah to modify her operational methods while maintaining the appearance of routine custodial work. She began varying her schedule irregularly, taking different routes to and from work and implementing counter-surveillance techniques that would have seemed paranoid for a cleaning woman but were essential for someone conducting covert intelligence operations. Her federal handlers had been concerned about the signs of hostile surveillance, but had been reluctant to extract her from an assignment that was producing intelligence of exceptional quality. Castellano's criminal network included connections to organized crime families in 3 different states, and Sarah's documentation of their financial arrangements was building cases that could dismantle decades of criminal enterprise. The decision to maintain her cover had seemed reasonable at the time, based on assessments that the surveillance was probably routine security measures implemented by Castellano's organization rather than evidence of a specific threat to her safety. Federal analysts had calculated that the benefits of continued intelligence gathering outweighed the risks of maintaining her position. That calculation had proven catastrophically wrong when Thompson, Kowalski, and Rodriguez had surrounded her in the parking garage beneath her apartment building. Now, suspended in chains while Rodriguez studied the scar that marked her as something far more dangerous than a simple federal informant, Sarah understood that her carefully maintained cover was completely blown. These men knew details about her activities that suggest access to information sources beyond routine criminal counterintelligence capabilities. "You're not FBI," Rodriguez said, stepping back from her suspended form with the cautious respect of someone who had suddenly realized he might be over his head. Sarah smiled for the first time since her capture, the expression carrying implications that made all 3 of her captors visibly uncomfortable. "No, they don't." Thompson lowered the branding iron slightly, uncertainty replacing his earlier eagerness to inflict pain. "Then who the hell are you?" The question hung in the warehouse air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying weight that none of the men present could fully understand. Sarah's transformation from terrified victim to something infinitely more dangerous was complete now, revealing depths of training and experience that contradicts everything they thought they knew about the woman they had abducted. But revealing her true identity would require explanations that could put far more than her own life at risk, exposing operations and personnel that existed in the shadows between legal law enforcement and activities that required different kinds of authorization entirely. Instead, she tested the strength of her restraints with movements so subtle that her captors barely noticed, calculating angles and leverage points while maintaining eye contact with Rodriguez. Her years of maintaining a false identity had taught her patience, but her original training had taught her that patience was only valuable when combined with the ability to act decisively when circumstances required immediate response. The scar on her shoulder had been given to her by people who understood that some kinds of work required permanent marks of membership in organizations that officially didn't exist. The warehouse door exploded inward with the force of shaped charges, sending twisted metal fragments across the concrete floor like deadly confetti. Through the smoke and debris stepped a figure that made Rodriguez's blood freeze in his veins, a tall woman in tactical gear whose presence transformed the abandoned building into a battlefield in the span of heartbeats. Agent Diana Cross moved with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to hostile environments, her weapon tracking smoothly across potential targets while her eyes assessed the tactical situation with professional detachment. Behind her, 3 additional figures emerged from the smoke, spreading out to secure the warehouse perimeter with movements that spoke of extensive combat experience and coordinated training. "Step away from the asset," Cross commanded, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made resistance seem futile rather than merely inadvisable. The suppressed submachine gun in her hands remained steady despite the chaos of the explosive entry, its barrel never wavering from center mass on Rodriguez's torso. Thompson dropped the branding iron with a clatter that echoed through the warehouse, the heated metal hissing against the concrete floor as he raised his hands in automatic surrender. Kowalski attempted to reach for a pistol tucked into his waistband, but stopped when Cross's weapon shifted to track his movement with mechanical precision. "Smart choice," Cross said, without taking her eyes off the three captors. Anyone who moves without permission gets to discover how effective modern body armor is against armor-piercing ammunition. Rodriguez studied the tactical team with the careful attention of someone trying to identify exactly how much trouble he was in. Their equipment was military-grade, but bore no identifying marks or unit insignia that would indicate which agency they represented. Their coordination suggested extensive training, but their willingness to use explosive charges in an urban environment indicated authorization levels that went beyond conventional law enforcement protocols. "Federal agents," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own assessment. "You're here about the Castellano investigation." Cross smiled without humor, the expression carrying implications that Rodriguez found deeply unsettling. Federal agents don't typically conduct rescue operations using methods that would violate half a dozen international treaties on urban warfare. Try again. While Cross maintained tactical overwatch, one of her team members approached Sarah's suspended form with bolt cutters that made quick work of the chains holding her captive. Sarah's feet touched the concrete floor for the first time in hours, but she remained steady despite the ordeal she had endured, her posture suggesting reserves of strength that contradicted her apparent exhaustion. "Status report," Cross said, as Sarah rubbed circulation back into her wrists, the question carrying the crisp formality of military communications. "The cover is completely blown," Sarah replied, her voice taking on a professional tone that matched Cross's bearing. "They have surveillance footage, detailed knowledge of operational methods, and access to intelligence sources we haven't identified. The federal investigation is compromised at levels that suggest penetration of classified systems." Thompson stared at the exchange between the two women, gradually understanding that he had been spectacularly wrong about almost everything he thought about their captive. The terrified cleaning woman had been replaced by someone who communicated with tactical teams using language that suggested familiarity with intelligence operations far beyond anything involving conventional law enforcement. "How long have they been watching you?" Cross asked, her weapon still trained on Rodriguez while she processed Sarah's report. "At least 3 months of confirmed surveillance, possibly longer. They knew about the photographic equipment, the listening devices, even my apartment layout and daily routines. Someone provided them with operational details that aren't available through normal criminal counterintelligence methods." Kowalski found his voice despite the tactical situation that kept him frozen in place. "What the hell is going on here? You're supposed to be a cleaning lady who was spying on our boss. Now you're talking like some kind of special forces operative." Cross turned her attention to him with the kind of focused interest that made him immediately regret speaking. "Your boss hired you to interrogate someone you believed was conducting industrial espionage against his legitimate business interests. But you never asked yourselves why a cleaning woman would have the technical skills necessary to bypass electronic security systems or the training required to plant surveillance devices without detection." Rodriguez had been listening to the conversation while calculating escape routes and assessing the tactical capabilities of Cross's team. His experience with criminal organizations had taught him to recognize when situations had escalated beyond his ability to control, and the professional competence displayed by the rescue team suggested resources that exceeded anything he had encountered during his career in organized crime. "Castellano told us she was working for the feds," he said, abandoning any pretense of maintaining operational security. He said she had been photographing financial records and planting bugs in his office. He wanted to know which agency she worked for and what kind of evidence they had gathered. Cross and Sarah exchanged a look that carried information Rodriguez couldn't interpret, but which clearly indicated that Castellano's assumptions about Sarah's organizational affiliation had been as wrong as his own. Vincent Castellano made the same mistake you did, Cross said, her tone suggesting that the error had been both predictable and costly. He assumed that anyone conducting surveillance of his operations must be working for a federal law enforcement agency. The possibility that other organizations might be interested in his activities never occurred to him. Sarah moved to where her torn clothing lay scattered on the warehouse floor, retrieving a small device that looked like a standard cell phone but bore modifications that marked it as sophisticated communications equipment. She activated the device with a series of keystrokes that suggested familiarity with encryption protocols, then waited while it established secure connections through channels that were definitely not part of any commercial cellular network. "Control, this is Phoenix," she said into the device, using terminology that made Rodriguez realize he had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple federal investigation. "Cover is blown and extraction is required. Package integrity is compromised and hostile forces have demonstrated capabilities that exceed criminal counterintelligence parameters." The response came through the device's speaker, audible to everyone in the warehouse despite the encrypted transmission. The voice belonged to a man whose authority was evident even through the electronic distortion, someone accustomed to making decisions that affected operations spanning multiple countries and involving resources that governments preferred not to acknowledge officially. "Understood, Phoenix. The extraction team is en route to the secondary location. Interrogation of hostile forces is authorized to determine the source of intelligence compromise. Use whatever methods are necessary to identify the leak." Cross's expression shifted to something that made all three captors suddenly wish they had chosen different careers. "You heard the man. We need to know who told you about Phoenix's operational methods and how they gained access to classified surveillance footage." Thompson looked between his partners with growing panic, understanding that the situation had moved far beyond anything their employer had prepared them to handle. They had been hired to intimidate a cleaning woman into revealing federal secrets, but instead they had captured someone whose rescue required military-grade tactical teams and authorization from organizations that operated outside conventional government oversight. "We don't know anything about intelligence sources," he said, his voice cracking under the stress of facing people who possessed capabilities that made his earlier confidence seem laughably naive. "Castellano just told us what to ask and said the information came from someone reliable." Rodriguez realized that their only chance of survival lay in complete cooperation with people who clearly possessed both the authority and capability to make them disappear permanently. "Castellano has been getting information from someone inside the federal task force investigating his operations, someone who knew about the cleaning woman's real activities and wanted her stopped before she could gather enough evidence for indictments." The revelation hung in the warehouse air like a toxic cloud, carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. If Rodriguez was telling the truth, then Sarah's federal cover had been blown by someone with access to classified case files and operational details that should have been restricted to a small number of investigators and supervisors. Cross activated her own communications device, establishing contact with whoever had authorized the rescue operation. "Control, we have confirmation of federal task force penetration. Hostile forces received operational intelligence from someone with access to classified case files. Request immediate investigation of all personnel with knowledge of Phoenix's assignment." Sarah's transformation was complete now, the frightened custodian replaced entirely by someone whose bearing and communication methods marked her as a member of an organization that possessed resources and authority beyond anything her captors had imagined. Cross secured the warehouse perimeter, while Sarah activated a portable data terminal that interfaced with satellites orbiting somewhere above the Detroit skyline. The device projected holographic displays that showed intelligence networks spanning 3 continents, financial transaction patterns involving dozens of shell corporations, and personnel files marked with classification levels that didn't appear in any official government documentation.
7 years ago, Sarah began, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone delivering a classified briefing. I was Captain Sarah Martinez, Army Intelligence, stationed at Fort Huachuca with a specialty in financial crimes investigation. My commanding officer recommended me for a joint task force investigating terrorist funding networks that were using legitimate businesses to launder money for operations targeting American interests overseas.
Rodriguez watched the holographic displays with growing comprehension of exactly how far out of his depth he had ventured. The financial networks shown on Sarah's terminal included several organizations he recognized from his work with Castellano, but the scope of the investigation revealed connections that extended far beyond simple money laundering for domestic criminal enterprises. The task force was a cover story, Cross added, monitoring the warehouse entrances while Sarah accessed files that painted a picture of global financial conspiracies. What Captain Martinez actually joined was Project Cerberus, a joint intelligence operation involving CIA, NSA, and Defense Intelligence Agency resources focused on disrupting terrorist financing through methods that conventional law enforcement couldn't employ. Thompson stared at the evidence of his catastrophic miscalculation, understanding that he had participated in the torture of someone whose work involved protecting American national security interests. The cleaning woman's identity had been so convincing that even professional criminals had accepted it without question, never suspecting that her technical skills and surveillance capabilities indicated training far beyond anything available to civilian contractors. Project Cerberus operatives received specialized training in deep cover operations, financial intelligence analysis, and what the military euphemistically calls enhanced interrogation techniques. Sarah continued, calling up personnel files that showed her graduation from programs that were classified beyond the access levels of most government officials. We were taught to infiltrate criminal organizations, gather intelligence on terrorist funding sources, and eliminate threats using methods that would never appear in any official government record. The holographic displays showed training facilities located in remote areas of Nevada, Virginia, and Colorado, where operatives learned to blend into civilian populations while conducting intelligence operations that required capabilities beyond those of conventional law enforcement. Sarah's file indicated proficiency in languages that included Arabic, Farsi, and Mandarin, along with technical skills involving electronic surveillance, financial analysis, and what the documentation referred to as direct action capabilities. The brand mark, Cross explained, noting Rodriguez's continued attention to the scar on Sarah's shoulder, is applied during the final phase of Cerberus training. It identifies operatives to each other and serves as permanent proof of authorization to conduct operations that exist outside normal military command structures. Kowalski found his voice despite the overwhelming evidence that he had been spectacularly wrong about everything involving their captive. If you're some kind of super-secret government agent, what would you do working as a cleaning lady for a two-bit money launderer in Detroit? Sarah's expression hardened with memories that were clearly both painful and classified. Because 3 years ago, Project Cerberus was officially terminated following a mission that went wrong in ways that threatened to expose American intelligence operations across the Middle East. The surviving operatives were given new identities and assignments that would keep us safely contained while the government decided what to do with people who knew too much about operations that never officially happened. The holographic display showed mission reports from operations conducted in Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, where Cerberus operatives had infiltrated terrorist financial networks and eliminated key personnel using methods that would have created international incidents if their American origins had been discovered. The scope of their activities included assassinations, sabotage operations, and financial disruption campaigns that had prevented dozens of terrorist attacks against Western targets. The Istanbul operation was supposed to be routine intelligence gathering, Cross said, accessing files that painted a picture of an assignment that had escalated far beyond its original parameters.
Phoenix and her team were investigating a terrorist cell that was using Turkish banks to fund operations in Europe. What they discovered was a network that included corrupt officials in the Turkish government, arms dealers with connections to Russian intelligence, and American contractors who were selling military equipment to terrorist organizations. Rodriguez listened with growing understanding of the political complexities that had led to Project Cerberus's termination. Operations that exposed corruption in allied governments or revealed connections between American contractors and terrorist organizations created diplomatic problems that often outweighed their intelligence value. We had documented evidence that could have dismantled terrorist funding networks across the entire region, Sarah said, her voice carrying the frustration of someone whose mission had been abandoned for political considerations. But the evidence also implicated American officials and defense contractors whose exposure would have damaged relationships with NATO allies and disrupted military operations that the Pentagon considered more important than counterterrorism efforts. The holographic displays showed financial records that traced terrorist funding through a maze of legitimate businesses, charitable organizations, and government contracts that involved billions of dollars and extended into the highest levels of international commerce. Sarah's team had spent months documenting transactions that proved systematic corruption involving officials from multiple countries. The decision was made to terminate the operation and eliminate the evidence rather than risk the diplomatic consequences of exposing American involvement in activities that violated several international treaties. Project Cerberus operatives were reassigned to positions where their knowledge could be contained and monitored, while the government calculated the long-term risks of allowing people with their capabilities to remain in active service.
Thompson struggled to comprehend the implications of what he was hearing. So you were punished for being too successful at your job? Sarah's laugh carried no humor whatsoever. We were punished for discovering evidence that powerful people preferred to keep buried. The terrorists we had been investigating were less important than protecting American officials who had been taking bribes to facilitate their operations. The warehouse filled with the kind of silence that accompanied revelations too large for immediate comprehension. Rodriguez understood that his employer's problems extended far beyond federal money laundering investigations into areas involving national security operations that possessed resources and authority beyond anything he had encountered during his criminal career. Vincent Castellano's money laundering operation caught our attention because it was processing payments for some of the same terrorist-connected networks we had investigated during Project Cerberus. Sarah continued, accessing financial records that showed connections between Castellano's clients and organizations that appeared on classified terrorist watch lists. My assignment to investigate his operations was supposed to be routine follow-up work, gathering evidence for federal prosecution while maintaining a low profile. Cross-monitored communications traffic that indicated increasing activity from agencies responding to Sarah's blown cover. What Phoenix discovered was that Castellano's operation wasn't just laundering money for domestic criminal organizations. He was processing payments for international networks that included some of the same terrorist funding sources that Project Cerberus had been investigating before the program was terminated. The revelation transformed the warehouse interrogation from a simple criminal matter into something involving national security implications that extended far beyond Detroit's boundaries. Sarah's surveillance of Castellano had uncovered connections to terrorist financing networks that the government had previously decided were too politically sensitive to pursue through official channels. Someone with access to classified Project Cerberus files recognized the connection between my current assignment and our previous investigations, Sarah said, her voice carrying the cold anger of someone who had been betrayed by people she had trusted with her life. Rodriguez realized that his role in the interrogation had been orchestrated by forces far more sophisticated than simple criminal counterintelligence. Someone had wanted Sarah captured, and not necessarily by federal agents who would have access to classified information about her true background and organizational affiliation. The scar on Sarah's shoulder represented membership in an organization that had been officially disbanded, but whose surviving operatives remained valuable assets for operations that required capabilities beyond those of conventional intelligence agencies. Her years as a cleaning woman had been both punishment and preparation for assignments that would inevitably require her to return to the shadows where Project Cerberus had operated before political considerations had forced its termination. Cross's communications device erupted with urgent transmissions from multiple sources, the encrypted channels carrying reports that transformed the warehouse from a simple rescue site into a tactical command center. Sarah watched the incoming intelligence with growing alarm as patterns emerged that suggested their blown cover was part of a much larger operation targeting former Cerberus operatives worldwide. Control reports that Agent Harper in Berlin went missing 6 hours ago, Cross announced, her voice tight with professional concern. His apartment showed signs of professional abduction, and German intelligence found surveillance equipment that matches the specifications you identified in Castellano's operation. The holographic displays shifted to show global positioning data for the 17 surviving Project Cerberus operatives, their locations scattered across 4 continents in assignments that had been designed to keep them separated and contained. Red indicators began appearing on the map as Control's intelligence network reported disappearances, suspicious activities, and confirmed hostile actions against operatives who had believed their new identities provided adequate security. Johnson in Tokyo was found dead in his hotel room this morning, Sarah read from incoming reports, her training allowing her to process the devastating news with clinical detachment. Cause of death appears to be enhanced interrogation techniques followed by professional execution. Local authorities are treating it as Yakuza violence, but the methodology matches Cerberus training protocols. Rodriguez listened to the reports with growing comprehension that his involvement in Sarah's interrogation had been orchestrated as part of a systematic campaign against people whose capabilities made them extremely dangerous when threatened. The professional competence displayed by Cross's rescue team suddenly seemed less impressive when compared to the scope of the forces arrayed against former Project Cerberus operatives. Someone has decided that containing former Cerberus personnel is no longer sufficient, Cross said, analyzing intelligence patterns that revealed coordination between hostile forces operating in multiple countries. The systematic nature of these operations suggests access to classified personnel files, operational histories, and current assignment details that should be restricted to the highest levels of American intelligence leadership. Thompson watched the global tactical display with the fascination of someone witnessing events far beyond his comprehension. The warehouse interrogation that had seemed like routine criminal intimidation was revealed as one component of an international conspiracy involving resources that exceeded the capabilities of most government agencies.
The Istanbul files, Sarah said, accessing classified records that painted a picture of corruption extending into the highest levels of American government and military leadership. Someone wants to ensure that the evidence we gathered about terrorist financing and American official involvement never surfaces in any form. The holographic displays showed financial networks that connected terrorist organizations with defense contractors, government officials, and intelligence agencies across multiple countries. The scope of the corruption documented by Project Cerberus included arms sales to terrorist groups, intelligence sharing with hostile foreign governments, and systematic theft of military equipment intended for legitimate allied forces. Eliminating the operatives who gathered this evidence ensures that it can never be used for prosecutions or congressional investigations, Cross analyzed, her tactical assessment revealing the political motivations behind the current threats. Dead witnesses can't testify about corruption that involves billions of dollars and threatens the careers of people who consider themselves untouchable. Kowalski found himself caught between professional criminals and intelligence operatives whose conflict involved stakes that made his previous criminal activities seem like minor infractions. If these Cerberus people have evidence that could bring down government officials, why don't they just release it and expose the corruption? Sarah's expression carried the bitter knowledge of someone who had learned painful lessons about the relationship between evidence and justice in cases involving national security.
Because the same officials who were involved in the corruption control the agencies that would be responsible for investigating and prosecuting the crimes. Exposing them would require going through people who have every reason to ensure the evidence disappears permanently. Cross received additional intelligence reports that indicated escalating threats against the remaining Cerberus operatives. Martinez in Sao Paulo reports hostile surveillance using military-grade equipment. Chen in Singapore has identified at least 6 operatives conducting coordinated observation of his residence and workplace. Patterson in London was approached by individuals claiming to represent American intelligence agencies, requesting voluntary debriefing about his Project Cerberus service. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone with comprehensive knowledge of Project Cerberus personnel and capabilities was systematically locating and targeting operatives whose elimination would ensure permanent silence about evidence that threatened powerful interests. The scope of the operation suggested resources that exceeded those available to criminal organizations or foreign intelligence services. Domestic agencies, Sarah concluded, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had witnessed government betrayal before. Someone within American intelligence leadership has decided that former Cerberus operatives represent an unacceptable risk to national security interests. Rodriguez understood that his participation in Sarah's interrogation had been orchestrated by forces whose capabilities made his criminal employer seem amateurish by comparison. The professional methods used by Thompson, Kowalski, and himself had been effective against a cleaning woman, but would be completely inadequate against someone whose training included resistance to enhanced interrogation and escape from hostile custody. The question, Cross said, monitoring communications from intelligence agencies that were responding to reports of the warehouse incident, is whether control has the authority and resources necessary to protect surviving operatives against threats that appear to originate from within the American government itself. Sarah accessed personnel files that showed the chain of command responsible for Project Cerberus operations, revealing a network of officials whose careers had been built on the success of operations that were now politically inconvenient. The decision to eliminate evidence by murdering the operatives who had gathered it represented a level of desperation that suggested imminent exposure of corruption involving the highest levels of government. They're not just trying to silence us, Sarah realized, analyzing intelligence patterns that revealed the true scope of the threat. They're trying to eliminate all evidence that Project Cerberus ever existed. The operatives, the case files, the financial records, everything that could connect current government officials to the terrorist financing networks we investigated. Cross's tactical assessment painted a picture of enemies who possessed resources equivalent to those of a hostile nation-state, complete with intelligence capabilities, operational teams, and political authorization that exceeded anything available to conventional criminal organizations. The warehouse rescue had been successful, but it had also revealed their position to forces whose response capabilities remain unknown. Immediate extraction is required, Cross concluded, her professional judgment indicating that remaining in Detroit would expose them to threats that exceeded their current tactical advantages. The warehouse location is compromised, local law enforcement will respond to the explosive entry, and hostile forces will adjust their operational methods based on our demonstrated capabilities. Sarah gathered intelligence materials that documented connections between Castellano's money laundering operation and the terrorist financing networks that had originally attracted Project Cerberus's attention. The evidence represented years of careful investigation that could expose corruption involving billions of dollars and dozens of high-ranking officials. The Istanbul files are stored in a secure facility outside government control, she said, making a decision that would commit her to a course of action with consequences extending far beyond personal survival. If we can reach them, we have evidence that could expose the entire network of corruption that someone is killing to protect. Thompson listened to the conversation with growing understanding that the warehouse interrogation had been the opening move in a conflict involving resources and stakes that made conventional criminal activities seem insignificant by comparison. His participation in torturing a federal informant had evolved into a conspiracy that threatened the foundations of American intelligence operations.
The holographic displays showed tactical scenarios for extracting Sarah and her intelligence materials from Detroit without detection by hostile forces whose capabilities remained largely unknown. Each option involved risks that could result in capture or elimination by enemies whose training equivalent to their own. Immediate extraction is required, Cross concluded, her professional judgment indicating that remaining in Detroit would expose them to threats that exceeded their current tactical advantages. The warehouse location is compromised, local law enforcement will respond to the explosive entry, and hostile forces will adjust their operational methods based on our demonstrated capabilities. Sarah gathered intelligence materials that documented connections between Castellano's money laundering operation and the terrorist financing networks that had originally attracted Project Cerberus's attention. The evidence represented years of careful investigation that could expose corruption involving billions of dollars and dozens of high-ranking officials. The Istanbul files are stored in a secure facility outside government control, she said, making a decision that would commit her to a course of action with consequences extending far beyond personal survival. Thompson listened to the conversation with growing understanding that the warehouse interrogation had been the opening move in a conflict involving resources and stakes that made conventional criminal activities seem insignificant by comparison. His participation in torturing a federal informant had evolved into a conspiracy that threatened the foundations of American intelligence operations. The holographic displays showed tactical scenarios for extracting Sarah and her intelligence materials from Detroit while avoiding detection by hostile forces whose capabilities remained largely unknown. Each option involved risks that could result in capture or elimination by enemies whose training equivalent to their own.
But the alternative, allowing the systematic murder of former Project Cerberus operatives to continue unchallenged, would ensure that evidence of massive government corruption remained buried while terrorist financing networks continue operating with American official protection. Sarah looked at the brand mark on her shoulder, understanding that it represented membership in an organization that had been betrayed by the same government it had served faithfully. The choice between personal safety and exposing the truth would determine whether Project Cerberus operatives died as forgotten casualties of political expedience or as heroes who had sacrificed everything to protect American national security interests. The secure communications array in Cross's tactical vehicle revealed the scope of resources available to former Project Cerberus operatives who chose to abandon their cover identities in favor of active resistance. Sarah watched intelligence feeds from satellites, listening posts, and human assets positioned throughout the global intelligence community as control coordinated a response that matched the sophistication of the forces arrayed against them. Phoenix, your psychological profile indicates 78% probability of choosing mission completion over personal safety. Control's voice carried through encrypted channels from a location that remained classified even from operatives with Sarah's clearance level. Confirm your commitment to retrieving the Istanbul files regardless of personal risk factors. Sarah felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling across her shoulders like a familiar piece of equipment she had stored away but never forgotten how to use. The cleaning woman's identity had served its purpose, but the skills and instincts that had made her valuable to Project Cerberus were reasserting themselves with increasing intensity. Confirmed, she responded, her voice taking on the crisp professionalism that had characterized her communications during active operations. Request tactical support for infiltration of the storage facility and extraction of classified materials. Cross monitored Detroit police frequencies while coordinating with intelligence assets positioned throughout the Midwest corridor. The warehouse incident had triggered law enforcement responses that would complicate their movement, but also provided cover for activities that would otherwise attract unwanted attention from federal agencies whose loyalty remained uncertain. We have a 12-hour window before hostile forces can coordinate a systematic search of the greater Detroit area, Cross analyzed, reviewing intelligence reports that painted a picture of enemies whose capabilities include satellite surveillance, electronic intercept, and human assets positioned throughout law enforcement and intelligence agencies. After that, our operational security depends on staying ahead of forces whose resources exceed our own. The Istanbul files were stored in a private security facility located 90 minutes outside Detroit, operated by a former CIA contractor whose discretion had been purchased through methods that ensured his continued cooperation with Project Cerberus interests. The facility's security measures had been designed to protect materials from both criminal theft and government seizure, requiring specialized equipment and expertise that matched Sarah's training. Rodriguez watched the operational planning with growing comprehension of the forces he had inadvertently become involved with through his participation in Sarah's interrogation. The professional competence displayed by Cross's team during the warehouse rescue was revealed as routine capability for operatives whose training exceeded that of most military special operations units. The storage facility is protected by biometric scanners, motion detectors, and armed security personnel whose background checks exclude anyone with government connections. Sarah explained, accessing floor plans and security protocols from memory systems that had been installed during her original Project Cerberus training. Standard infiltration techniques won't be sufficient given the time constraints and the facility's defensive capabilities. Thompson and Kowalski remained under guard while Cross's team prepared equipment that would support the Istanbul file retrieval operation. Their continued detention served multiple purposes, preventing them from reporting the incident to Castellano or other hostile forces, gathering additional intelligence about the network that had targeted Sarah, and potentially recruiting them as assets whose criminal backgrounds provided access to resources unavailable through official channels. We need transportation, communications equipment, and weaponry that can't be traced to government sources, Cross said, reviewing operational requirements that exceeded what her tactical team had brought to Detroit. Criminal organizations possess resources that intelligence agencies can't access without creating documentation that could expose official involvement. Rodriguez recognized an opportunity to demonstrate value that might improve his prospects for survival in a situation that had escalated far beyond his ability to control through conventional criminal methods. Castellano has warehouses throughout the region with equipment that could support your operation: security systems, vehicles, weapons, communications gear, everything acquired through channels that would never connect to government agencies. Sarah studied Rodriguez with the analytical attention she had once applied to potential intelligence assets in hostile territories. His offer represented tactical advantages that could significantly improve their operational capabilities, but accepting assistance from criminal sources involved risks that include compromise of operational security and potential betrayal by someone whose loyalty could be purchased by higher bidders. "What guarantee do we have that you won't contact Castellano the moment we release you?" Cross asked, her tone suggesting that betrayal would result in consequences more severe than anything Rodriguez had experienced during his criminal career.
"Because Castellano set me up," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the bitter anger of someone who had realized he had been manipulated by forces whose agenda extended far beyond his understanding. He knew that the cleaning woman was more than she appeared, and he sent us to interrogate her knowing we would be walking into a situation we couldn't handle. We were expendable assets used to test her capabilities and confirm her identity. The revelation transformed Rodriguez from a simple criminal captor into a potential ally whose motivation for revenge aligned with Project Cerberus interests. His knowledge of Castellano's operations, combined with his access to criminal resources, made him valuable for activities that required capabilities beyond those available through official intelligence channels. Castellano's cooperation with whoever exposed your identity suggests connections that extend beyond simple money laundering for domestic criminal organizations, Sarah analyzed, reviewing intelligence patterns that revealed systematic coordination between criminal enterprises and government officials whose agenda involved eliminating Project Cerberus evidence. He's not just processing payments for terrorist financing networks. He's actively participating in the conspiracy to silence operatives who could expose American official involvement.
Cross received intelligence updates that indicated increasing hostile activity throughout the region as forces loyal to the corruption network mobilized resources to locate and eliminate the surviving Project Cerberus operatives. Time was becoming a critical factor as their enemies demonstrated capabilities that matched or exceeded their own operational advantages. The transformation back to active operational status requires accepting risks that we've been avoiding for 3 years, Sarah said, acknowledging the psychological shift from protective cover identity to offensive capability that characterized the return to Project Cerberus methods. But the alternative is allowing the systematic murder of operatives whose only crime was serving their country too effectively. The equipment preparation phase revealed the extent to which Project Cerberus training had prepared operatives for situations requiring complete self-sufficiency in hostile environments. Sarah's muscle memory guided her through weapons checks, communications protocols, and tactical planning procedures that had been dormant but never forgotten during her years as a custodial worker. The Istanbul files contained financial records, communication intercepts, and photographic evidence documenting terrorist financing networks that include American officials, defense contractors, and intelligence personnel. She explained to Rodriguez and his partners, whose cooperation would be essential for accessing criminal resources without triggering government surveillance. Exposing this evidence will result in prosecutions that could reach the highest levels of American government and military leadership. Thompson listened to the operational briefing with growing understanding of the stakes involved in their decision to assist or obstruct the Project Cerberus mission. His choice would determine whether he became an asset supporting national security interests or an obstacle that would be eliminated through methods he preferred not to contemplate. The brand mark on Phoenix's shoulder isn't just identification, Cross explained, noting Thompson's continued attention to the scar that had transformed their interrogation into a rescue operation. It's authorization to conduct operations using any methods necessary to protect American national security interests, regardless of legal constraints or diplomatic consequences. The warehouse had become a staging area for an operation that would either expose massive government corruption or result in the elimination of the last witnesses capable of documenting terrorist financing networks that operated with American official protection. Sarah's transformation from cleaning woman to active operative was complete, but the mission ahead would test every skill she had learned during her years with Project Cerberus. Rodriguez understood that his participation in the mission represented both an opportunity for revenge against Castellano's betrayal and insurance against elimination by forces whose reach extended far beyond conventional criminal capabilities. His choice between cooperation and resistance would determine whether he became an asset or a liability in an operation whose success could reshape American intelligence operations for decades. The equipment loading phase revealed tactical capabilities that exceeded anything Rodriguez had encountered during his criminal career, including weapons systems, surveillance equipment, and communications technology that indicated access to military resources through channels that bypassed official procurement procedures. Project Cerberus operatives possessed authorization to acquire whatever equipment was necessary for mission success, regardless of legal restrictions or budgetary constraints. Sarah felt the familiar anticipation that had characterized her mental state before dangerous operations in hostile territory. The skills that had been suppressed during her cover assignment were fully active now, tactical awareness replacing the comfortable routine of custodial work as she prepared for activities that would either vindicate Project Cerberus sacrifices or add her name to the list of operatives who had died protecting secrets that powerful people preferred to keep buried.
Rodriguez understood that his participation in the mission represented both an opportunity for revenge against Castellano's betrayal and insurance against elimination by forces whose reach extended far beyond conventional criminal capabilities. His choice between cooperation and resistance would determine whether he became an asset or a liability in an operation whose success could reshape American intelligence operations for decades. The equipment loading phase revealed tactical capabilities that exceeded anything Rodriguez had encountered during his criminal career, including weapons systems, surveillance equipment, and communications technology that indicated access to military resources through channels that bypassed official procurement procedures. Project Cerberus operatives possessed authorization to acquire whatever equipment was necessary for mission success, regardless of legal restrictions or budgetary constraints. Sarah felt the familiar anticipation that had characterized her mental state before dangerous operations in hostile territory. The skills that had been suppressed during her cover assignment were fully active now, tactical awareness replacing the comfortable routine of custodial work as she prepared for activities that would either vindicate Project Cerberus sacrifices or add her name to the list of operatives who had died protecting secrets that powerful people preferred to keep buried.
Perimeter is clear, Sarah whispered into her communications device, reporting to Cross, who maintained an overwatch from a concealed position 3 kilometers away. Guard rotation is proceeding according to the schedule Rodriguez provided, moving to the primary access point. The biometric scanner that protected the facility's main entrance had been installed by the same contractor who had provided security systems for several CIA safehouses. Its specifications designed to prevent unauthorized access while allowing legitimate users to retrieve their materials without bureaucratic oversight. Sarah's biometric profile remained active in the system despite Project Cerberus's official termination, an oversight that would prove crucial for accessing the Istanbul files. Inside the facility, climate-controlled storage areas maintained optimal conditions for preserving documents, electronic media, and physical evidence that represented decades of intelligence operations conducted outside official oversight. Sarah's storage unit contained materials that documented terrorist financing networks spanning 3 continents, including financial records that proved systematic cooperation between American officials and organizations that had been designated as terrorist entities by the same government whose representatives were accepting their payments. The Istanbul files occupied 17 secure containers, each one containing evidence that could support prosecutions involving billions of dollars in illegal transactions and dozens of high-ranking officials whose careers had been built on corruption that threatened American national security. Sarah began transferring the materials to portable storage devices that would allow the evidence to be transmitted to media organizations and congressional investigators simultaneously. "Control, this is Phoenix," she reported while copying files that contained photographic evidence of American officials meeting with known terrorist financiers in locations that should have been off-limits to unauthorized personnel. "Package retrieval is proceeding according to schedule. Evidence integrity is confirmed and ready for distribution." Cross monitored law enforcement frequencies that indicated increasing activity as hostile forces coordinated search operations throughout the Detroit metropolitan area. Their 12-hour operational window was closing rapidly, but the intelligence gathered during the warehouse incident had provided tactical advantages that kept them ahead of enemies whose resources exceeded those of most government agencies. "Phoenix, be advised that hostile forces have identified the storage facility location and are moving tactical teams into position for assault operations." Control's voice carried through encrypted communications from satellites positioned beyond the reach of electronic countermeasures. "Extraction window is reduced to 30 minutes maximum." Sarah accelerated her file transfer procedures while maintaining the methodical thoroughness that had characterized her Project Cerberus training. The evidence contained in the Istanbul files represented the culmination of years of dangerous operations conducted by operatives who had sacrificed their official careers to protect American interests, and its preservation justified whatever personal risks were necessary for mission completion.
The sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions indicated that hostile forces had deployed military-grade assets for an operation that exceeded the capabilities of conventional law enforcement. Sarah completed her file transfers and activated distributed transmission protocols that would simultaneously deliver the evidence to investigative journalists, congressional oversight committees, and international human rights organizations whose independence from American government influence ensured the information would reach public attention regardless of official attempts at suppression. Package is transmitted and confirmed by multiple independent sources, Sarah reported while preparing defensive positions within the storage facility. Mission objectives are achieved regardless of extraction success. Rodriguez's voice crackled through communications he had acquired through criminal channels that remained outside government surveillance capabilities. Castellano's people are moving on your position with support from federal tactical teams. Someone has convinced law enforcement that you're a terrorist threat requiring maximum force response. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that operatives who had spent years fighting terrorist financing networks were now being hunted by the same government they had served. Their elimination justified through the same national security rhetoric they had once used to authorize their own operations against legitimate threats to American interests. Cross-coordinated extraction procedures that would either retrieve Sarah safely or ensure that her elimination was witnessed and documented by media sources whose coverage would validate the evidence she had transmitted from the Istanbul files. Project Cerberus operatives understood that their most valuable contribution might be the manner of their deaths rather than their continued survival. "The brand mark you saw on my shoulder," Sarah said to Rodriguez through communications that were being recorded for later transmission to oversight organizations, represents authorization to protect American national security interests using any methods necessary. Today, that means exposing corruption that threatens our country's security more than any foreign enemy ever could. The first explosive charges detonated against the facility's main entrance, as tactical teams began their assault using methods that would have been excessive for apprehending simple criminals, but were routine for operations involving threats to national security.
The evidence being transmitted contains financial records proving that American officials accepted payments from terrorist financing networks in exchange for intelligence that resulted in the deaths of American military personnel. Sarah broadcast while defensive fire echoed through the storage facility. These same officials are now authorizing the elimination of Project Cerberus operatives who gathered this evidence in service to their country. Thompson and Kowalski, monitoring the operation from Cross's tactical vehicle, watched their former captive transform from cleaning woman to national hero through her willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that transcended personal survival. Their participation in her initial torture had evolved into witnessing her vindication through evidence that would reshape American intelligence operations for decades. The assault teams breached the storage facility's defensive perimeter using military equipment that confirmed government involvement in operations designed to eliminate witnesses to massive corruption. But Sarah's mission was already complete. The Istanbul files were being analyzed by investigative organizations whose independence ensured that the evidence would reach public attention regardless of her personal fate. "Control, this is Phoenix making final transmission," Sarah reported while preparing for extraction or last stand depending on tactical developments. The truth about Project Cerberus operations and American official corruption is now beyond government control. Mission accomplished. Cross received confirmation that media organizations were already publishing preliminary reports based on Sarah's transmitted evidence. Their coverage triggered congressional demands for investigations that would expose the full scope of terrorist financing networks that had operated with American official protection. The systematic murder of Project Cerberus operatives would now be investigated by oversight committees whose authority exceeded that of the intelligence agencies involved in the conspiracy. Rodriguez coordinated with Cross to provide extraction support using criminal resources that remained outside government surveillance. His motivation for revenge against Castellano's betrayal aligning perfectly with Project Cerberus' interests in exposing corruption that threatened American national security. His transformation from captor to ally represented the kind of operational success that had made Project Cerberus effective before political considerations had forced its termination. The final phase of the operation revealed the true purpose of Sarah's 3-year assignment as a custodial worker, positioning her to gather intelligence that would either expose or confirm the terrorist financing networks that Project Cerberus had originally been created to combat. Her cover identity had been both punishment and preparation for a mission that would vindicate the sacrifices made by operatives who had died protecting their country's interests. 6 months later, congressional hearings based on the Istanbul files resulted in indictments involving dozens of officials whose corruption had facilitated terrorist operations against American interests. Project Cerberus was officially reinstated under new oversight procedures designed to prevent political interference with operations involving national security threats. Sarah Martinez received a presidential commendation that acknowledged her service without revealing details that remained classified. Her brand mark now representing validation rather than exile for choices that had protected American lives through methods that required authorization beyond conventional legal constraints. The woman who had once pushed a mop through corporate offices while gathering evidence against terrorist financing networks had proven that some truths were worth any sacrifice, and that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when principles mattered more than personal safety. Rodriguez established a consulting business that provided security services to organizations requiring protection from threats that exceeded conventional law enforcement capabilities. His criminal background transformed into valuable expertise for legitimate purposes. Thompson and Kowalski received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony that supported prosecutions based on evidence from the Istanbul files. The brand mark that had nearly been duplicated through torture had instead become a symbol of integrity that inspired a new generation of intelligence operatives whose mission was protecting American interests through methods that honored effectiveness and accountability. Project Cerberus operatives would never again be abandoned by the government they served. Their sacrifices would be recognized as essential contributions to national security that deserved official protection rather than political suppression. Sarah's story became a classified legend within intelligence circles, proof that individual courage could overcome institutional corruption when guided by principles that transcend personal interest and political expediency. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.